Hey guys, it's been a while since I've gotten to sit down and do one of these videos. As you can probably imagine, it has been an absolutely crazy season between almonds. This is my favorite time of day to work bees. Blueberries. All right, this is our fourth splitting queens, moving bees, pretty much all of the above. So we haven't had a moment to really slow down and chat, but honestly, I've really missed putting together these videos because over the last few months, I have been watching what's happening not just in beekeeping, but really just in agriculture as a whole. And I can't shake this feeling that something is changing.
Check out this roundup in Texas. Some 2 million bees escaped when a tractor trailer overturned about 100 miles east of Houston. At one point, so many bees gathered on a tree that a huge branch snapped under the weight. Authorities warned neighbors to stay in their homes. Beekeepers are still at the scene trying to gather as many as possible so they can take them to local honey farms.
The farmers I've talked to tell me the loss is devastating. However, they say the diverse range of crops they plant will help them survive. Here at Turkey and Orchards, it's usually all about the apples, but early this season, the trees aren't showing much life at all.
It was really a catastrophic loss for our whole region, not just here at Turkey and Orchards.
A rare late April freeze wiping out apples and peaches across the East Coast.
Never have we lost multiple crops all at once for the season.
New Jersey's Department of Agriculture estimates farmers lost $300 million worth of fruit.
This is what we call a generational freeze, almost like a 100-year storm. And like I said, a perfect event.
And it's not one big thing either. Really, it's just 100 small things just all compiling into one big, huge mess. So if you've been in agriculture long enough, you really learn to pay attention when things start to get a little bit weird. Not catastrophic, just weird. Like the weather not acting the way it's supposed to. And, well, numbers, really, they just stop making sense. And people, when that happens, start making decisions that they normally wouldn't make before. And that is exactly what I've been watching happen this year. What first started as a rough almond season has now snowballed into something that is much bigger. Beekeepers are feeding when they should be making honey. Colonies that normally would have found a home in the almonds end up sitting on the sidelines. Truckloads of bees literally just flipped on their side in ditches or on the side of the road. And we've also got insurance and relief programs that are tightening up. And really all across the country, both farmers and beekeepers are starting to look at their numbers and wondering, how are we going to make this make sense? Now on the surface, none of these seem connected. But I think it is. Because when you start to step back and take a look at the bigger picture, a story starts to emerge. And honestly, I think it's a story that every beekeeper and probably every farmer needs to be paying attention to, because I don't think we're just looking at a bad season. I think we're actually watching a business model that much of commercial beekeeping was built on start to shift in real time. So the question isn't whether the beekeeping industry is changing, because let's face it, it is. The question is, how much is it changing? And whether we're actually paying attention before it forces a lot of people to make some very hard decisions. So grab a cup of coffee. Let's talk about the state of the beekeeping industry. Now let's start with almonds, because whether people like it or not, almonds do drive a huge portion of the commercial beekeeping industry. Now what's interesting about this year though, is that if you would have asked any of the beekeepers during the bloom how they thought that the almond crop was going to turn out, we would have all said that it wasn't looking great. I was one of those beekeepers. And that's because there were storms that were moving through the bloom. We had cold temperatures, we had rain. In some areas, we saw that many growers described a flash bloom where everything came on all at once. So the bee flight was limited at the same time that the pollination window was also compressed. And really, there was a lot of concern about what kind of crop California was actually going to produce. But now Now that we're deeper into the season, the story is starting to look a lot different. So the USDA is currently estimating a crop of around 2.7 billion pounds, and Blue Diamond's estimate came in almost exactly at the same at 2.69 billion pounds. So that's really just right there in line with what California has typically produced from year to year. So in other words, despite any of the weather challenges, California is still expected to put up a pretty respectable almond crop. And that is where things get interesting, because if growers can produce a normal crop during a difficult bloom year, all while acreage is declining, orchards are being abandoned, and more self-fertile varieties are also being put into production, what does that mean for pollination demand moving forward? That's the question that a lot of beekeepers are quietly beginning to ask. And that is because for decades, almonds have been really the financial backbone of the entire commercial beekeeping industry. Many operations have built their entire business model around that February paycheck. And really, the almond check wasn't just extra income for these operations. Often, their entire livelihood depended on that almond paycheck. But at this point, the industry is starting to shift. Growers today are under a tremendous amount of economic pressure. According to Blue Diamond, many almond growers spent 4 of the last 5 years selling almonds below their cost of production. Some reduced fertilizer applications, some cut pest management programs, some just decided to abandon the orchards entirely because they simply could not afford to maintain them. All while at the same time, bearing acreage is actually declining for the very first time in decades. So, gosh, really think about that. Less acreage, more self-fertile varieties, improving pollination efficiency, and growers constantly looking for ways to reduce costs. I don't think you need a crystal ball to see where this conversation is headed. So, if a grower can achieve acceptable yields with fewer colonies per acre, eventually somebody is going to start asking, why are they paying for 2 hives when they think they only need 1? And before anyone gets upset, I'm not saying that almonds are going away. We are far from that. California almonds are still a massive industry. They still take up around 80% of the entire world's production in almonds. Shipments do remain strong internationally. Europe continues buying. India remains one of the largest customers in the world. And the federal government just this past winter stepped in and purchased almonds for food assistance programs to help support demand. So the almond industry isn't disappearing, but the pollination model that we have known up to this point may be changing. And we're already getting a glimpse of it from this past year. So last year, 2025, many beekeepers felt that there actually weren't enough bees available to pollinate the almonds. We had one of the biggest die-offs in really all of our history across the entire industry. But this season, we saw something completely different. Some operations struggled to place colonies. Some accepted lower prices, and others sat on their bees instead of renting them. And whenever you have more suppliers competing for the same contract pool, margins get squeezed. That is just economics 101, which means the question facing the commercial industry isn't whether almonds will continue. The question is whether the golden age of commercial pollination is starting to come to an end. Because if growers need fewer bees and beekeepers keep producing the same number of colonies, somebody is eventually going to be left standing when the music stops. And this is where things start to get a little bit more concerning. You see, commercial beekeeping is a lot different than what most people think. Beekeepers, they don't wait until February to decide whether or not they're going to pollinate almonds. The money has already been spent months before those hives ever touch the ground in California. The feed has already been bought, the treatments have already been applied, labor has already been paid for, the trucks are already lined up. So when a beekeeper builds colonies expecting to send them to almonds and then suddenly doesn't have a place to put those bees, that is a problem. Because even if the paycheck disappears, those bills, they just keep on rolling in. And that is kind of what we saw this year. Last year, it felt like everyone was scrambling to find enough bees, but this year, there were more bees than places to put them. That's a pretty dramatic shift in just one season. Now, I'm not saying that the sky is falling. Commercial beekeepers are some of the most resilient people that you will ever meet. If there's a way to adapt, we will find a way. But when margins start to get tighter, people have to start making different decisions. Maybe you hold off on buying that new equipment. Maybe you stretch out some old comb for another couple years. Maybe you decide to sell some colonies to free up some cash. The market is currently flooded with that right now. Maybe you stay a little lighter on your feeding for that year than you normally would. Maybe you even start looking for cheaper options and cheaper mite treatments. Wherever you can find a shortcut, you take it. And honestly, I don't blame anybody for doing that. Farmers are really doing the same thing right now. Everybody is looking for a way to decrease any of their input costs and save a little bit of extra money. But the problem is, the bees have a way of making you pay for those shortcuts later. You can save money today, but then September shows up, then October, then the winter, and suddenly those decisions start catching up to you pretty quick. That's why I think this fall is going to tell us a lot about where the industry really stands. It's easy to be optimistic in the spring, but fall is when your report card comes out. And well, if the almond situation wasn't enough for the year, Mother Nature felt like she needed to throw her hat in the ring too. Because no matter where you look across the country, somebody got dealt a bad hand. Out in California, after the bloom, growers were hit with more storms, high winds, fluctuating temperatures, and now the crop is actually running 10 days ahead of normal. Luckily, according to Blue Diamond, the industry still appears to be positioned to produce a crop pretty close to normal. So that's good. But almonds are not the only crop dealing with weird weather this spring. I remember seeing that there were other fruit growers really across the entire United States and even into the valley talking about how quickly the temperatures were swinging. It got warm enough to push things ahead and then just in time for the cold and the frost to move back in right as everything was blooming. And when fruit is blooming, that kind of weather can make or break a farmer's entire year. And then you move into the southeast. And honestly, it's hard to overstate how dry it actually got. By April, nearly the entire Southeast was dealing with drought conditions. Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and the Carolinas had been dealing with months of precipitation deficits. There were wildfires that broke out across parts of Georgia and Florida. Burn bans were put in place. Really, all the farmers and beekeepers were just sitting and praying for rain and hoping that things would turn around. And one of the hardest stories that I came across was a beekeeper from Georgia whose entire operation burned up in one of those fires. Everything just gone. Pretty much having to start over from zero. Then on top of the drought came the freezes. Fruit growers across multiple states were hit with late season cold snaps after a little bit of warm weather had pushed all of the crops into a very vulnerable state. We have Michigan blueberries, which are currently expected to be about 20% below normal production. You have Arkansas reporting that a March freeze likely eliminated their peach crop. You also have orchards in Pennsylvania and West Virginia that saw catastrophic losses, with some growers reporting up to 100% losses. That is insane. Then you also have Maryland, Virginia, and New Jersey, who also took damages to their apples, blackberries, and strawberries. And then Louisiana and Texas peach crops were hit hard by late March freezes as well. Florida also had earlier winter freezes that caused major citrus loss and massive losses in the blueberries as well. This list just really keeps on going. And this is where I start to connect it back to beekeepers, because when fruit growers lose a part of their crop, or really their entire crop, they're not just losing fruit, they're losing income. And when farmers lose income, what do? We look for ways to cut our costs. We look at every single input, trying to figure out where we can squeeze out everything we possibly can. Maybe that would be the fertilizer, sprays, labor, equipment. And yes, sometimes, maybe it can be pollination. So even though the bad weather hit the growers first, that pressure can absolutely trickle down to the beekeepers. And we're going to see how that plays out over the next couple years. Then you head over to the Dakotas, and this is where every beekeeper's ears should perk up, because North and South Dakota are two of the most important honey producing regions in really the entire country. A lot of commercial beekeepers rely on that summer honey crop in order to keep their operation afloat. But heading into the summer, drought has been expanding across parts of the northern plains. South Dakota went from roughly 1/3 of the state being in a drought at the start of the spring to now over half the state is in a drought, with extreme drought conditions increasing substantially. And if that continues throughout the summer, that's something that every honey producer in America is going to be watching closely, because less moisture means less forage, and less forage means less nectar, and well, less nectar, that means less honey. Then here in the Midwest, we had almost the complete opposite problem. We had a little warm stretch there for a minute, and then it felt like spring just completely turned off and went away for the rest of the year. We had nothing but cold and rain and clouds and more rain and more rain and more cold. Really, just week after week. Most of May felt more like April. Colonies that should have been really exploding in population at that point were stuck inside their box, so blitz progressed slower, nectar flows never really hit their stride in a lot of areas, and a lot of beekeepers, instead of making honey, a lot of us were feeding. And on top of that, blueberries came early this year, which brought some beekeepers back to Michigan earlier than expected, right in time for that cold and rain. So why does all of this matter? Weather doesn't have to completely wipe out a crop to hurt profitability. Sometimes all it has to do is decrease the yield by just 10%. Maybe it delays field work. Maybe it increases feed costs, slows colony growth, cuts the honey crop in half. But the thing is that agriculture is a margin business. And when the weather takes a little bit from everybody at the same time, those losses start adding up really quickly. And I actually think we're starting to see some of that pressure show up in other parts of the industry as well. Because it seems like for the last month, every single week, I've seen online a new trailer full of bees flipped over in a ditch on the side of the road, abandoned on the side of the road, in some sort of hauling incident that it's actually starting to get pretty concerning. Now, bee hauling is not the same as hauling like a load of lumber down the highway. You're hauling live livestock. And, well, every single pallet has tens of thousands of living insects inside of it. So everything about that load matters. The airflow matters, the strapping, the weight distribution matters, timing, where you stop matters. Every turn that you make matters when you're hauling a load like that. A driver can haul freight for 20 years and still have absolutely no idea how to haul a bee load, especially when you're hauling a load that is as top heavy as hives can be. Now, every accident is different, so I don't want to pretend and sit here like I know everything about what happened in every single case. But what I can tell you is that a lot of these situations involve things that experienced bee haulers spend years learning how to avoid. Because when a truckload of bees ends up on its side, it's not just a transportation problem. That is somebody's livelihood. That is months of work, thousands of dollars in equipment, and that's potentially an entire year's worth of income sitting in a ditch on the side of the road. And when you zoom out and look at everything that we've talked about so far, I don't think that it's unreasonable to ask whether some of these incidents are connected to the economic pressure that we're seeing throughout the industry. Fuel costs are very high right now. Margins are getting even tighter. Everybody is looking for ways to save money. I get it. And when that happens, people naturally start shopping for cheaper trucking. But at the same time, if you think about it, hauling bees looks very attractive to the truck driver. Somebody sees what bee haulers get paid and they're like, hey, I can do that. That's easy. That's not a big deal. But in reality, this is one of the most specialized loads in agriculture. And you don't learn how to haul bees overnight. So honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if over the next few years, we start to see more restrictions, more training requirements, maybe even some new things and updates to the insurance for the drivers, just to put in more standards for hauling bees. Because right now, there's simply too much money, too many bees, and too much risk involved for things like this to continue the way that it has. And unfortunately, trucking is not the only area where beekeepers are discovering that the safety nets aren't always as strong as we thought. For years, a lot of beekeepers have relied on programs like rainfall insurance or also ELAP to help soften the blow a little bit when Mother Nature decides that she wants to hit you. Not every year is a good honey year. Not every year has ideal forage conditions. And when losses start piling up, those programs can actually be the difference between staying afloat and taking a major financial hit. But what I'm hearing from more beekeepers is that they're actually finding that these programs aren't always as straightforward as you might think. Take rainfall insurance, for example. A lot of people hear the term rainfall insurance and assume that it works just like drought insurance. The forage dries up, the bees struggle, honey decreases in the hive, and, well, you get a payout. But that's not actually how the program works. The program doesn't look at your honey crop, and it doesn't look at your bee yard either. It also doesn't look at whether your colonies actually made honey. Instead, it is looking at rainfall data that is collected across a much larger geographical grid. And that's where things start to get frustrating, and this may be where a lot of beekeepers are starting to run into problems. Because anybody who's spent any time in agriculture knows weather can change dramatically, even just over a few miles. One side of the county gets soaking rain, meanwhile the other side of the county is still as dry as a crisp. But if enough rain falls within that larger reporting grid, the numbers may show conditions as normal, even when individual beekeepers are experiencing drought conditions on the ground. Then you also add migratory beekeeping into the mix as well because, well, commercial beekeepers, they're not stationary. They're moving from almonds to, say, blueberries to honey yards to the Dakotas. Trying to match coverage periods, locations, forage conditions, and rainfall grids can get really complicated really fast. And another thing that many beekeepers don't realize is that rainfall insurance isn't necessarily protecting against every weather problem. It is only designed around precipitation. It's not designed around extreme heat, high winds, not if a bloom ends up burning up because it's too hot, not if it rains too much and ends up flooding everything out. Sometimes the weather hurts production without triggering any of the insurance. And I think that's where some of the frustration may be coming from. Because I've heard some rumors that they've been having some problems with rainfall insurance, but I will just leave it at that for now. Now let's talk about ELAP, because that program is changing too. From what I'm hearing, the Farm Service Agency, or FSA, is putting greater emphasis on certifications, documentation, colony counts, and making sure that the numbers that are being reported line up with what producers have on file, and also comparing that to their rain insurance numbers. And honestly, it does make sense from an agency's perspective. Whenever a government program gets larger or requires more money like that, there's usually more pressure to verify information and make sure that the payments are going where they're actually supposed to. But it also means more paperwork, more documentation, more deadlines, more opportunities to make mistakes. And well, if there's one thing that beekeepers are known for, it's spending their time in their bee yards, not sitting behind a desk filling out forms. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that these programs don't work. For many operations, they have been incredibly valuable. But I do think that a lot of beekeepers are realizing that these programs were never intended to replace profitability. They are only there to provide assistance. They should not be a line on your balance sheet. They're only a safety net, and safety nets only work when you understand how they're actually built. And personally, it wouldn't surprise me if these programs continue to tighten over the next several years. Really, agriculture as a whole is under increasing scrutiny right now. Government budgets are under pressure, and weather events, including insurance to cover those, are becoming more and more expensive. And as people utilize these programs, the demand for documentation and verification is probably only going to increase, which means understanding the rules may be just as important as understanding the bees. And I think that's just a reality that beekeepers are going to have to adapt to. And now, if that all wasn't enough, let's talk about honey. Because A lot of people hear everything we've talked about so far and think, okay, well, if almonds are getting tougher, why don't beekeepers just focus on making more honey? And honestly, if only it were that simple. You see, honey is on its own set of challenges right now. For years, one of the biggest conversations in the industry has been increasing the honey prices. Many beekeepers will tell you that honey has been selling at below production cost. Between labor, production, equipment, feed, treatments, fuel, and everything else that goes into keeping bees healthy and alive, the math simply ain't mathin'. So naturally, the industry's focus has been on raising the honey prices. And on the surface, it does make sense. But here's where things get a little bit more complicated, and I think this is where we should maybe challenge that thought a little bit. We are no longer in a market where American beekeepers are only competing against each other. We're instead competing with honey all over the world. From India, from Pakistan, Vietnam, Argentina, Brazil, China, and dozens of other countries that are all producing honey at different costs and under different economic conditions. So, what happens if America's honey prices suddenly were to rise? Well, that's great news for American beekeepers, but it's also great news for every foreign supplier looking at the United States and seeing an opportunity. If American honey becomes more valuable, that can create even more incentive for more imports to flow into the market, which means the solution is not quite as simple as just simply asking, can we raise the honey prices? The bigger question, I think, is actually this. How can we produce more American honey? Because if we can produce more honey while maintaining quality, while maintaining healthy colonies, and increasing demand for American honey, that is a much different conversation. But then we run into another problem. How exactly do we produce more honey? Because when you look around the country this year, Mother Nature has not played easy. The Southeast was dry, the Dakotas are watching drought conditions expand, the Midwest spent pretty much all of May cold and wet, and you can't make honey if the flowers are not producing nectar. The bees can only work with what nature gives it. Which means maybe part of the solution isn't pricing. Maybe instead it is forage, it's habitat, maybe it's improving the landscapes our bees depend on. And maybe part of the answer is something that brings us one of the biggest challenges that the beekeeping industry faces today: mites. Because if there's one thing that can destroy a colony faster than a bad honey market, it is mites. And this is where things start to get a little bit more concerning. When the money gets tight, people start looking for places to save money. This is a repetitive trend in this video. That is just human nature. And unfortunately, mite control is one of the most expensive parts of modern beekeeping today. Treatments cost money, the labor costs money, monitoring your mite levels also costs money. Really everything costs money. So if a beekeeper didn't make much honey this year because of the weather, and the margins are already tight, there's always going to be a temptation to push things just a little bit further. Maybe that treatment waits another week, then another week, and another week. Maybe you convince yourself that mite numbers aren't that bad. And even worse, maybe you just put it off and say, I'll deal with that later. It's not fall time yet. This is honey season. And most of the time, those decisions, they don't hurt you immediately. The problem is that they tend to show up months later. They show up in October, in December, when you're cracking open those hives and seeing if they are grade worthy to send to almonds. And then suddenly, people start asking why the losses are so high. I do genuinely hope that I'm wrong. But if we're already seeing pressure showing up in trucking, if we're already seeing pressure also show up in pollination, people selling bees, and if the weather conditions limit production, I do worry about what the numbers might look like this fall. Because if enough colonies struggle heading into winter, we could easily find ourselves in the opposite conversation next year. Instead of too many bees, we might be back at not enough bees. And that is exactly why I think that the industry desperately needs a new cheap mite control immediately. Not next year, not 5 years from now, but today. Because healthy colonies are really the foundation that everything sits on. Honey production sits on healthy colonies, pollination sits on healthy colonies. Really, the entire industry sits on the back of healthy colonies. And if we really want to increase honey production in America, maybe that's where the conversation needs to start. Healthy bees, affordable mite control, and landscapes that are full of diverse forage. And yeah, you also have good truckers, good brokers, people who do what they say they're actually going to do. Because when margins get tight, trust becomes incredibly valuable. The operations that survive the next decade aren't necessarily going to be the biggest. And really, that's what this entire video comes down to. When people ask what's happening in the beekeeping industry right now, this is the answer. The old system is tightening, almonds are changing, pollination as a whole is changing, honey is under pressure, weather is now just simply unpredictable, insurance programs are becoming more complicated, and the costs just keep on rising. Which means that beekeepers are being forced to adapt faster than they ever have before. Now, don't get me wrong, I do just want to clear up. I don't think that beekeeping itself is dying. We're actually far from it. This industry has survived things that would have put many businesses out of business 100 years ago. But I do think that we're entering a period where the easy answers are starting to disappear. The golden days of relying on just a single paycheck out of almonds, a single honey crop, or even a single pollination contract may actually be coming to an end. And so the next chapter of beekeeping is going to belong to the people who understand their numbers, diversify their income, build strong relationships, and stay one step ahead of the change. And if there's one thing that I've learned from agriculture, there's been many, but if there's one thing, it is that pressure has a way of revealing who was prepared and who was not. So if I had one piece of advice moving forward, it would be this: pay attention. Because a lot is changing, and whether you're a beekeeper, a farmer, or just somebody who cares about where their food comes from, I have a feeling that the next few years are going to be very interesting. So all I can say is buckle up, because I think a storm is starting to brew. All right. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Don't quit and be fed.